why perhaps you worry justifiably over whether this Lord of the Rings series would continue after the Salt Lake City trip. And it is continuing. So I have done chapters 10, 11, and 12, the end of quote-unquote book 1, of course somewhat confusingly because we tend to think of the Fellowship of the Ring as a book, the Two Towers as a book, and the Return of the King as a book. But internally to the Lord of the Rings, there's 6 books that are divided up, with the first 2 being the Fellowship, the second 2 being the Two Towers, and the third 2 being the Return of the King. So now I have finished the first of those 6, so the first half of the Fellowship of the Ring. And probably in Patreon office hours next week, it'll be interesting to hear more people's thoughts about up to this point in The Lord of the Rings, 1/6 of the way through. Pretty massive book. So let's see what sort of things I took note of this time. Reaching back for this annotated copy, which surely someone will wind up with in their mailbox. I'll have to figure out exactly how to do that. Maybe as was suggested, just a absolutely random dice roll. We'll see. Anyway, the main event of these last 3 chapters of quote-unquote book 1 is, of course, the appearance of Strider or Aragorn. And it's interesting that so much is made in the book itself about how strange Aragorn seems to the hobbits. He seems like he either must be really ugly, because they make a big deal out of him not looking good. I don't know if he's just really dirty because he spends all his time outdoors and that's what we're talking about, but he seems notably ugly. It's also interesting when Frodo was first talking to him that he says, quote, "You began to talk to me like the Bree folk, but your voice has changed," off quote. So Aragorn has some kind of distinctive accent that doesn't sound like the people that Frodo's used to. That's interesting. It's neat. I'm not sure what being suggested as Aragorn's accent. Is it Elvish sounding? Is it more like a Gondoric accent because he's of Numenorean extraction, and maybe families of that ilk have maintained some kind of different way of speaking the common speech. I don't know, but it's it's a neat little world building thing that Tolkien builds in there. There is a moment when Butterbur is talking, and he mentions a time when, quote, "all the dogs were yammering and the geese screaming," off quote. And I thought that the geese screaming might distantly be a shout out to the fact that happens in the killing of Sigurdur in the Eddic poems. I might actually be able to put my finger on the exact words of that if I remember which poem that's in. But when Sigurdur is killed, Brynhildr laughs, and the geese scream. And I mean, it sticks out in the memory from having read through that story so many times, because it's so strikingly unusual that it's something that's highlighted like that. I'm probably not going to find it just digging around like this. But anyway, I wonder if that's a shout out to that. It would not surprise me, given his interest in Norse literature, and specifically, of course, in the Volsung material. He rewrote, after all, a lost part of the Eddic poems about Sigurdur and Gudrun as his own legend of Sigurdur and Gudrun. Right? Here it is. I actually found it. It's Sigurdur Kuthin Skama, the short poem of Sigurdur, stanza 29. Gulu vid gasi tuni. The geese in the yard, they called in reaction, screamed in reaction. Um, I thought that it was another good example of Tolkien building in a sense of backstory that we don't always get to hear when uh, Butterbur and Strider and their initial interactions actually seem familiar with each other. So we see that not just, you know, the very prime characters of our narrative so far are the hobbits, but also the people who so far are still kind of background people. You know, we don't know at this point in the story that Strider is going to be that big of a deal. Strider and Butterbur know each other and have had interactions. You could probably write books about the two of them together. I think it's something that Tolkien does really well as far as that world setting. One thing that kept coming to mind was as Butterbur talks about the ring wraiths, he keeps calling them black, right? Not just black riders, but he likes to say black men and black man singular. And I kept thinking to myself, you know, how much in 7 decades has changed about the way that people describe other people. I don't think this was a common term as it is today for, say, African Americans in the 1950s. I don't think that Tolkien actually would have considered that this might have sounded racist, you know, out of context, out of his own historical context. It's interesting to me that, you know, I'm not sure I have heard people observe this as racist in language. I guess people do understand the 1950s, 1940s context of it, but you know, it's disturbing to reflect that, of course, you know, translators at different times can use terms that come to sound racist later, and this is part of my problem with 19th century and early 20th century translations of Norse works, is that sometimes the terms used without racist connotations by 19th and early 20th century translators, like, one that comes up in particular is quote-unquote swarthy, which, you know, is not even a word of my own native English vocabulary, but, you know, modern-day racists take that from 19th and early 20th century translators and read more racism into those Norse sources than is there. Whereas both, you know, the poets of the Eddas and J.R.R. Tolkien really aren't concerned with making any kind of racist message as far as I can read from it. And, you know, it's unfortunate that, of course, these words can make one think that there is a more racist intent there than I think there is, just because it sounds like some of this, like just listening to Butterbur talk about, quote, you know, a black man and, quote, black men, definitely out of context would sound racist in 2024. Anyway, I'll pass over that. Actually, another weirdly modern sounding in phraseology quote from him was calling Nob dumb. He says, quote, there are others in Bree quicker in the uptake than he is, off quote. I didn't know that was a phrase in the 1950s or 1940s. I thought that it was kind of funny that Tolkien called Gandalf's handwriting, quote, a quote, strong but graceful script, off quote. Like, this is kind of a language guy's fantasy, right? That my handwriting would be observed as strong but graceful. And then, of course, we get to the famous poem about Aragorn, the All That Is Gold Does Not Glitter poem. I've actually translated this into Old Norse, I think 8 years ago on Patreon. I'll share with you what I did with it. I wrote it out as Egi alt that skul isklittar, Egi allir þeir svara vilt villir, gamli så sterkres rotnar Egi, djupa rötter skada Egi af frosti, or oskunum skal eld vekja, or skuggunum mun ljós vella, brandr så spraut mun batna, ókrundi mun verða konungur aftur. So not everything that's gold, which glitters, not all those who go lost, go wandering wild, are lost. Kind of playing on the double meaning of Vidler there, both. It's just an adverb for sort of going randomly versus being truly lost. The old one that is strong does not rot. deep roots are not injured by frost. Out of the ashes, someone shall awaken fire. Out of the shadows, light will spring. Oh, because I was trying to make this kind of alliterate, right? Ba, ba, ba. So using Bronder for sword. That sword, which broke, will be repaired, and the uncrowned will become king again. And I note that in this 2016 effort here, unsurprisingly, because I read so much Nynorsk, I wrote Verta rather than Verda, so I guess you can call this a weirdly Old Norwegian version of this. Anyway, so that's been done in Old Norse by me. We get into, after Frodo reads the note from Gandalf, it really feels like the narrator and the hobbits are just busting Aragorn's chops absolutely about how ugly he is, right? Even Aragorn himself says, quote, "I believe my looks are against me." Pippin says, "Handsome is as handsome does," quote, so implying, Aragorn is so ugly that the only thing handsome about him is that he does things nicely. And then later Frodo says, quote, "You have frightened me several times tonight, but never in the way that servants of the enemy would, or so I imagine. I think one of his spies would, well, seem fairer and feel fouler, if you understand." You just feel like there's somebody in the background, calling an ambulance because Frodo just burned Aragorn for being so ugly. I don't know why they bust his chops about it so bad. It really seems like we're supposed to imagine that he looks like frighteningly bad. But he's not described in enough detail to understand what picture we're supposed to get there. I thought it was kind of funny that he's carrying around the broken sword in a sheath so that it's broken a foot below the hilt. Why are you carrying this thing around? Just leave it at home. Like in the movies, that's a little bit more satisfying that it's sort of left at home with all the shards. Why carry around this broken thing? It's, he's spending time in the woods. Doesn't he want to reduce the weight that he's carrying around? Why carry a useless weapon? I thought that it was interesting that even after he calls himself Aragorn, the narration still calls him Strider. I don't know if that's because he calls himself that. He says, quote, "Strider shall be your guide," off quote, using the third person. I don't know if he's kind of acting, if Tolkien, as the narrator, is kind of acting like a pedantic translator of say, an Old Norse text where, Loki is called both Loki and Lofter, or Odin is called both Odin and Ygr. Some translators, like it's a little bit pedantic, will translate, the name that you see there and not not who the character is, right? I'll take Loki and Lofter and make both of those Loki. I'll take Odin and Ygr and make both of those Odin. Because from our perspective as readers of narratives, we want people to have consistent names. I think that it's interesting that he seems to kind of separate Aragorn and Strider, like they're different, avatars of one being or something like that they need to be distinguished that way. I don't know if that's intentional, but I noticed that by the two towers, just flipping ahead, it looks like when Aragorn speaks, the narrator calls him Aragorn. Yeah. "I doubt if you will find a path quicker than the one that the orcs chose," said Aragorn on page 423 in the chapter of the Riders of Rohan. So, but at this point, I guess, in his role as wilderness guide, he is more Strider than Aragorn. All right, let me give you a quick word from my friends and partners at Grimfrost, and I'll come right back and talk a little more about chapters 11 and 12. All right, so chapter 11, we've been following the hobbits and Aragorn, and all of a sudden, I found this just whiplash. We're back in Crick Hollow with Fatty Bulger. I basically had already forgotten who that was because the narrative has moved on so far past this hobbit who was left behind. He is truly the Michael Collins of Frodo's Hobbit Apollo 11, although at least Michael Collins left behind a truly amazing book. Read Michael Collins' book about his experience on Apollo 11. Anyway, I don't know if this bit about Bulger is very interesting. But it did, I I was thinking about Michael Collins while I was reading this part. And just a little bit later we read, quote, Frodo was crushed by the news that the horses have run away. How could they hope to reach Rivendell on foot, pursued by mounted enemies? They might as well set out for the moon, off quote. There it is. It's what's that phenomenon called, where you think about something and you see it all the time? Here's the hobbits setting off for the moon, but the hobbits didn't make it, did they? It's USA. I thought that the scene of the hobbits walking out of Bree and Sam throwing an apple at the mean spy character Bill Ferny, and then saying, quote, waste of a good apple, off quote, actually seemed a little bit off character. I feel like it was Sam as a bully a little bit, and I didn't think that complimented his character much. He could have walked on, but I don't think the scene was too critical or central. Just thought it seemed off from what I had read of the character in the past 10.5 chapters. I note that the hobbits passed through a place called Midgewater. That the exact cognate of that, Icelandic Mývatn, is of course a major tourist attraction in northern Iceland. It is called that because there are a lot of little insects, especially during the summer. But I wonder if the place name had stuck out in Tolkien's mind because of that place name. Hard to say. By the way, that is it is at Mývatn that the front cover of my first book in its paperback form with the green aurora borealis, that's where that photo was taken. I thought there was a pretty good mystery in this section where Aragorn and the hobbits are sleeping, and somewhere in the distance they see bright lights flash in the eastern sky, but it's not lightning. I thought that was really good scene setting. Even if they had never resolved what this mystery was, we have a sense of some ominous events happening outside of their sight, outside of their control, outside of even Aragorn, who seems to know more things than he should, knowledge. I thought that was really neat and well done. Just a little bit after that, there's a quote where Aragorn says, quote, not all the birds are to be trusted, off quote. And I just thought, what? what are birds going to do? Actually, typically in Norse myth and in Finnish myth as well, birds, when they're speaking characters, are positive beings. In the saga of the Volsungs, which I'm often little things scratch the back of my mind, reminding me of the Volsungs material. We have the wagtails that talk to Sigurður. In one of the Helgi poems, Helgi Kvita Hjorvarð Solnar, it's some bird, I don't think it's specified what kind, that comes and talks to Atli at the beginning and sort of sets in motion the events of that poem and that legendary material. Birds talk some, but to me basically seem like forces for good. I can't think of an evil bird exactly. Maybe Hraesvelgr, who I think is supposed to be a Jotun who flaps his wings and causes the winds, but I thought that was a little bit striking. It just felt thematically very different from Norse or even Finnish myth, because he does definitely draw from material in the Kalevala. I thought it was interesting to see Strider being so superstitious, not wanting Frodo to talk about becoming a wraith, like he shouldn't even speak of such things. Pippin says the name Mordor, and Strider says, quote, do not speak that name so loudly, off quote. Seems to be a little bit more superstition than you would expect from the sophisticated, educated character of Aragorn, but that feels genuinely medieval to me, that belief in the power of words. So interesting detail, although I feel like the character in the movie is not portrayed as being quite so I don't know. It would feel a little bit off character for the way Viggo Mortensen portrays him in the movies. I thought it was funny possibly mildly annoying to hear Mary refer to a poem as a lay. I've always hated that word because it's a word that no one born after 1920 understands as a word for poem in English. Just felt pedantic. So did Strider, referring to, quote, the mode that is called an thanath among the elves, but is hard to render in our common speech, and this is but a rough echo of it, off quote. We just had heavy, I just got back from my summer break overseas, and, I spent so much time in Italy, I can't think of how to say this in English now. I can only say it in Italian to you peons at my high school. I don't know. I also thought it was a little off feeling when Aragorn tells the story about Beren and Luthien, and in talking about Luthien thousands of years before his lifetime. He says she was, quote, the fairest maiden that has ever been among all the children of this world, off quote. Isn't he engaged? What does he say about Arwen? Does he say she's the second fairest? Just weird from a guy that is talking about someone who's not even alive anymore. But I don't know. All right, so they go to Weathertop. Frodo gets injured by one of the ring wraiths, and I sound like the mayor in Jaws, right? We got the shark that has injured a couple bathers. And then we have the flight toward the bridge, and I thought that it was interesting that they were expecting trouble at the bridge. They were expecting maybe the ring wraiths were going to be there waiting for them to hurt them. But instead, we see that elves have been there before, and Aragorn finds, here I'll read you this paragraph, quote, he held out his hand and showed a single pale green jewel. Character quote, I found it in the mud in the middle of the bridge, he said. It is a beryl, an elf stone, off quote. So I wonder, is that supposed to be like a beryl, like the real thing? Is that supposed to be an elvish word, or is that supposed to actually be the gemstone beryl? If it is the gemstone beryl, I approve. Emerald is a kind of beryl, and I'm a great connoisseur of emeralds, turns out. So, cool. I think my household as a whole, we are great connoisseurs of emeralds. No reaction. All right. I thought that, there's Tolkien, I think I've mentioned this before, is a great... He really does a good job of situating you in the seasonality of the narrative, right? You feel like it's autumn. In fact, I keep feeling vaguely like Christmas is all around me in reading this, right? It's got some autumn winter vibes, right? But he's also pretty good. Because he's obviously gone on some serious outdoor adventures. He's pretty good at remembering that you have to pack for these things, and that's a severe pain, and it weighs a lot. And he really does think about that in terms of, do they have enough horses? Who's carrying what? I appreciate that extra little bit of context and realism in the story. You wouldn't necessarily expect realism about that in a fantasy, right? I don't think most stories of any genre are realistic about that stuff, but it's interesting that he is so realistic about it. I think commendable. I thought that it was interesting to see Aragorn refer to Etendales. Of course, that would be a good modern English descendant for a hypothetical Old English word. Etendale, right? Jotun Valley, right? Giant valley. And he calls that troll country, so that's a nice little linguistic Easter egg there. We were reminded of... I must have read The Hobbit in middle school or whatever too, but I don't remember it very well. There's a scene where some trolls turn to stone, right? And they find these trolls turned to stone. Of course, what a troll is in Norse myth is extremely, extremely vague. It essentially seems to be a word for anything supernatural that's not good. It's not a species, probably. In Tolkien's work, it seems to be a species, a large humanoid, evil-aligned thing. Now, in Norse myth, we do have beings that turn to stone in the sunlight. There's a dwarf named Alvis who is turned to stone by Sunlight at the end of Alvismol in the Poregera. There is a Jotun woman in the poem Helga Kvíði Hjörvarðssonar, which I earlier mentioned in connection with Talking Birds, who's turned to stone by sunlight. These aren't general characteristics of Jotun women or of dwarves. They seem to be more or less an element of plot convenience. When we need them to, bad guys can be turned to stone by the sun. And I wonder how much those scenes, probably those exact particular two scenes, are echoing in Tolkien's mind when he writes about this. It is interesting how different it is from the movie that Frodo is. In the movie, Frodo seems next to dead from his wound from the ring wraiths almost instantly. In the book, he recovers somewhat. You know, he says he's feeling better actually at some point in this chapter. So that was a surprising difference from the movie narrative. There are some weird little archaic things in Sam's song. He uses nuncle instead of uncle. You know, there's a lot of words in English where N's have either been added or deleted at the beginning because the N has either crept in from an or mine. So, for example, English adder for snake, it's originally an. It's originally a natter, us, snake, natter being the word for snake. Reanalyzed by speakers as an adder. The nickname Ned comes from speakers doing the opposite thing and adding an N from talking about mine Ed. Speakers reanalyzing that as my Ned. So nuncle looks like something similar has happened. I don't know if anybody says nuncle, but it was. I figured Tolkien must know some example of that, or is playfully making up an example of that. Sam's song also has axon for askin. Little known fact that axon actually is the earlier form of that word. It's Old English axion, the switch from ax to ask in modern English is metathesis. So Sam is in fact using a more archaic form. And he uses larn. I don't know where people say that. Apparently some parts of northern England, maybe in Appalachia somewhere. But he uses larn to mean teach. Quote, gave him the boot to larn him, which of course is archaic English, but also lära in Scandinavian is teach. I don't know where larn, warn, and darn all rhyme, but surely Tolkien has in mind someplace. I was reminded of another book, favorite novel of mine, when we hear about Bilbo giving away all the treasure that he got from a robber's stash. Frodo says, quote, he told me he did not feel it was really his as it came from robbers, off quote. And what that put me in mind of is a long conversation in favorite novel of mine, All the Pretty Horses by Cormac McCarthy, about there is a man in prison in Mexico who chastises the American protagonist because he says that Anglos have this rare attitude that money itself can be evil. And he says that this is a superstition, that money is just a tool regardless of how someone got it. And as much as I think there's some sarcasm maybe in that scene, it called to mind that. And then very, very different portrayal from the movie. Instead of Arwen coming to help at the end as they go over the river and get closer to Rivendell, it is a male elf, Glorfindel. So I understand absolutely why the filmmakers wanted it to be Arwen. It gives you a lot fewer named elves to keep track of. It's nice to have a more efficient list of characters. It's probably nice to emphasize the relationship between Aragorn and Arwen. It gives you a love story, which, as I understand it, is somewhere in the appendixes of this huge book and not really in the main narrative. But, the way that elves talk and are talked to, talked about, kind of like with Bombadil, I wonder, what are they doing when they're not out healing hobbits with their touch and rescuing hobbits and stuff like this? Like, what does the daily home life of Glorfindel look like, right? What does he get up to? You know, is he playing Scrabble with Elrond? I just don't get a sense of, unlike with the hobbits and even Aragorn, I just don't get a sense of what do elves do, right? In fact, what is an elf? Which, of course, it's very vague in our Norse sources, where, and I'm drawing quite a bit on the work of Adaman Jakobsson, who gave a great interview on this channel about this a few years ago. But elf in some ways seems to be the opposite of troll in Old Norse. It's a term for a being that is less than the gods, but not evil. And it seems to include things like dwarves. It seems to include some of the servants of the gods. But just to be a sort of vaguely humanoid being that's not evil. It's not specifically a creature with pointy ears. And I have never seen Tolkien say that it's specifically a creature with pointy ears. So I don't necessarily know what he wants us to picture. Maybe he says something more about this somewhere else, but my picture of them is much more like just a normal human who is stuck up than it is, Agent whatever from the Matrix of the pointy ears. All right, well, those are my thoughts on chapters 10 to 12. Appreciate you folks following along with the series. Thank you, Patreon, for your support. Someone over there will probably wind up with this book. And from Emerald Dell in beautiful Colorado, we are wishing you all the best.